All right, so congratulations. What does that mean? So, first things first, you've been looking for homes and you finally found the one that you want to make yourself home, right? So, now it's time to make the offer. And what do we do? Well, today I'm going to show you a step-by-step guide on how to craft your offer, what to put in your offer to protect yourself, and how to properly read your offer, as well as some other tips and tricks to know when putting offers in, as well as reading other documents that you'll need to sign. So a few other documents is going to confirmation of cooperation is one. That's how the agents get paid, and typically that's just whatever is listed on MLS. That's what your buyer agent will get paid. No cost to you. It all comes from the seller's pocket once the deal is closed, and then the last thing is obviously you're going to have typical stuff like RICO information guide and a buyer representation agreement. So I'm going to go through all those forms step by step. The first thing we're going to knock down is the agreement of purchase and sale. That is the first one, the most important one. After that, we'll go through the confirmation of cooperation, how it's typically filled out, and then we'll go through buyer agency and designated agency, as well as a RICO information guide. So let's go through. I'm going to pop on my camera here. We're going to go through, read it all together, and let's go. Alrighty, so here we are. We are going to look at the agreement of purchase and sale. So your first step when filling out the offer that you on a home that you would like to purchase, right? So agreement of purchase and sale, you can see here it's Form 100. So we're going to put in today's date, 27th of October, and we're going to say John Smith, right? Doesn't matter. Seller, Jason Smith, whatever. Property, you're going to put in all these different addresses. So you're going to put address is 123 Main Street, fronting on the side of. So this one is this one is pretty easy to figure out, but it's basically where your door is facing. So if it's facing south, northeast, west, whatever, right? It's fronting on the south side of whatever we'll call it Main Street, right? We have already used that in the city of, municipality of, district of, town of, and township of. So this is just depending on, typically if you're in Toronto, Ottawa, whatever, Montreal, it doesn't matter. You typically put city. If it's a smaller city or if it's a municipality, you're going to put municipality. If it's a district of, or if it's a town of or township, you're going to use those designations. And then this stuff will all get preloaded. So this, if you're working with an agent, this stuff will typically get preloaded when they upload the MLS, because the MLS comes with all that information. That's why we use it on MLS. But if it's a property that's off market, this will have to be filled out manually, because typically this stuff isn't available on MLS, right? So it's going to have a frontage of, let's call it 50 feet fronting. So that is the width. And then we're going to say depth of 100, right? So that is depth, and it's typically calculated in feet. And then the legal description. So this is legal description of land, including easements not described elsewhere. So it's going to say, city of Ottawa, lot 100, A5. It's going to have a whole bunch of different writing, which is going to be the legal description as what it was described as in the on Geo Warehouse typically. So this, if your agent can't find it, or if you can't find it, you can always ask them to look up the property on Geo Warehouse, and it'll be the first line when you pull up the property report. It'll give you the legal description of the property, and it'll include any easements and or what's not described, right? So basically, that's that for that. You don't have to worry about that too much. You just want to make sure that a lawyer reviews the legal description, that there's no issues with it. Purchase price. So let's say we're looking at a property that's 700,000. So we're going to put in 700,000. It's going to automatically populate that in here. Then we're going to talk about the deposit. So there's a couple of different things with the deposit. So let's say 700K, right? This is your offer. This is where you're going to negotiate the price. So if you wanted to offer 695, right? Just for the purpose of this example, we're going to put that in. Deposit is typically upon acceptance. So that's within 24 hours. Anything that is on the bill of sale, which is the agreement of purchase and sale, is as it's written. If you go down to the Schedule A, that's where you make your changes. So if you have this whole section blank, the Schedule A, if it's blank, that means the agreement is as is, right? So basically what that means is if you don't have a deposit within 24 hours of acceptance, your deal is dead, right? And then we're going to say, call it, we're going to put 10, so we're going to put $10,000 here, 10,000, and who is it going to go to? Buy negotiable, check payable to let's for my brokerage, it's EXP Realty. It could easily be Remax, Royal LePage, doesn't matter. Or sometimes it's a numbered company. Sometimes a seller will actually ask to have it held in their trust account as opposed to the brokerage. That's not very common, but just keep that in mind. Then we're going to talk about also herewith. The herewith is very rare to see. I don't see it in our market at all, really, to be honest with you, but it can be. I've seen it in some other markets where it is required. So like back when they were doing bidding wars, some people would say deposits to be herewith on offers, right? So basically what you want to do is just describe the difference as otherwise described in this agreement, so that you can do that. This also works as otherwise described in this agreement. So let's say you're overseas. Let's say you're making an offer on a property and you're on vacation and you have limited access to internet, to your banking, all that stuff, right? What you can do is you can put as otherwise described in this agreement and just basically copy and paste this, or just put deposit shall be done by the buyer within 48 hours or within 72 hours, whatever the case is. You just want to make it so it's clear, right? Because if you don't have any changes and it's just upon acceptance, that means your 24 hours starts ticking as soon as the offer is accepted, and we'll go down to where it's accepted after that. Sorry, let me just getting a bunch of messages here. We will turn that off right now. So we're going to go into do not disturb, and we are going to do that. So, pardon me. So Schedule A. So buyers agree to pay the balance as more particularly set out in the Schedule A attached. So what does that mean? So basically, everything's set in as the Schedule A. If there's any additional schedules, so you might have most offices, like most brokerages, might have a Schedule B. Schedule B is going to be for their interest-bearing trust account. So if they have a trust account where you deposit money and there's interest being accumulated on it, you have to acknowledge that. So they will put a Schedule B. So you'll put something like Schedule B, and then let's say you have a survey and they're calling that a Schedule S. You can put like that, and then you can also say, if there's a certain other schedule, depending, like let's say it's a probate and they have Schedule E and F, or if it's a new build, let's say you're buying a new build property, they might have Schedule B, C, D, E, F, G, just like that. They might even go up to Z, B1, B2. It doesn't matter. This is just to clarify that everybody's aware that there's more than one schedule, right? Irrevocability. This one, a lot of people actually get confused a little bit, because this offer shall be irrevocable by, if you're making an offer, you're the buyer. So it's irrevocable by the buyer until 9 p.m. And let's say we're picking, what's today? 27th, we'll go to the 28th. Okay. The completion date. So basically, when the seller, like let's say they don't accept your offer and they counter you an offer back, they're going to put the offer is irrevocable by the seller until the next day. And let's say they say, let us know by 12 p.m. if you plan to accept our counter offer. Right? So they'll do something like that. Oftentimes people think it's the reverse, so it's irrevocable to the seller or by the seller until such and such time. It's actually, no, you're irrevocably bound to this offer until such amount, right? So it's whoever's presenting that offer, counter offer, doesn't matter. Completion date. This agreement shall be completed by no later than 6 p.m. on the day. So let's say we do 30 days from now. What is that, 27th? So let's go to the 27th. Oops, pardon me. Let's go, whatever. We'll just click 28th just because it's easier. And we'll move my head a little bit there. So 28th of November, upon completion, vacant possession of the property shall be given to the buyer unless otherwise provided for in this agreement. So if you're buying a rental property and you have tenants, that will be notified in there, right? So that'll be changed. So notices, this is, typically you're just going to put buyers or sellers email here for notices, right? So nobody's really using fax these days just because it's time consuming, and who has a fax these days? So typically you're going to be doing most of your communication by email. Chattel's included. So this is going to be your fixtures, basically. So your appliances, anything that you want included in the property, you should be putting it there, but also separately notifying it in the Schedule A. Like let's say there's a really nice chandelier that you want, that's they're thinking of not including in the offer. If you want that added in there, I always say put it in the chattels and then put it in the Schedule A and have everybody initial it, just to make it extra clear. You can never be too clear when communicating these offers. So that's the one big thing. If you want fixtures excluded, this is another big one. So let's say there's a hot tub. right? Or there's a shed that you don't want, like it's a shed that's in rough condition. So you're gonna put like, typically we put here, what do? We do refrigerator, stove, oven, whatever, stovetop, oven, doesn't matter, right? Microwave / hood fan, if it's a combination. Let's be grammatically correct here. And then let's say dishwasher, washer, and dryer. And for the purpose of our example, we will say we want hot tub and all accessories associated to it included. Okay. Then we want here shed on the left hand side of the property as described in the MLS. So let's say they had it in the MLS as included in shed or whatever, right? We can do it like that. So that makes the onus on the seller to remove this property and to make sure that everything is still in good working order when this is removed. And I have more clauses to discuss about that once we get down to the scheduling. Rental items, including lease to own, and all that. So we can always talk about that down there. So let's say typically this will be a hot water tank. In the city of Ottawa, most hot water tanks on residential properties are leased or rented. So keep that in mind. Now, if we're talking about HST, HST is typically included in, unless there was HST that needs to be charged on it. So, like a new build property might not have HST included in. It all depends, but typically, if it's a resale property, so it's going from one seller that's living in it, and it's going to a buyer that's going to be living in it, it's going to be included in. Okay. Title search date. This is from when the lawyers do all their executions. So do the searches, do all the land transfer. So that is going to be 2 weeks before closing. So what do we put? 28th. So we put the 14th. Okay. And this is going to be residential. So you can put residential, multi-residential, residential condo. You just want to be, work orders of definition that its present use is residential, may be lawfully continued, right? So future use, title. So we're going to skip through some of these. I will put a copy of this just so you can, if you ever want to read through it, I'll put a blank copy of this, or actually I'll put a copy of this whole thing so you can see the Schedule A as well with all the standard clauses I put in. But for the purpose of this video, we're just going to go through the stuff that needs to be signed and all that stuff. So this is successors and assigned. So basically we're going to put here, whatever, John Smith, and the seller is Jason Smith. And here is the big portion, right? The confirmation of acceptance. So if you're making an offer, the seller is the one that needs to be accepting. If the seller is making you a counter offer, you're the one that needs to be accepting. So basically, what we can do is, and this should all be timestamped. So when you're doing DocuSign or DigiSign or AuthentiSign, it doesn't matter, whichever program you're using for the e-signatures, you want to be using something that's going to timestamp it here just to make it extra clear when it was signed, because it's going to have a code attached to each page and all that stuff. So for the purpose of this video, again, we're going to do, let's say 9 a.m. We're going to click that. And then we're going to go the next day, it was accepted. And we're going to say Jason Smith accepted it, right? So he accepted it. Listing brokerage info. So let's say I'm representing the buyer. So I'm going to put my name here, or sorry, eXp Realty, pardon me. And then here we're going to put my name. And then here would be whatever the other brokerage is. So if it's Royal LePage, put that. Remax, put that. And then the agent's name there. Telephone number, we can put the telephone number there. This part is the acknowledgement. So acknowledge receipt of my signed copy of this accepted agreement of purchase and sale, and I authorize the brokerage to forward a copy to my lawyer. And this is where you're going to put your lawyer's information. Typically, you don't need the lawyer information when you're negotiating this. You can get it anytime after it's been accepted, but you do need to have someone in mind when you plan on um, having this closed. After that, it's the commission trust agreement. So this is where the agent signs. So I would put my name here. So I would put Dean, and then the other agent would go there. So this is authorizing and allowing the listing brokerage to pay the buying brokerage, right? And it's agreeing that everybody's agreeing to the trust agreement. Put one extra J in there. So John Smith. So here they are. Typically, when you're putting in a Schedule A with conditions, you want to have it very neatly and properly put out. So so that the seller can properly understand how to read it and not be confused by, maybe you have things here, then here, then here. You want to make it nice, super easy to read. So basically, the buyer agrees to pay the balance of the purchase price. This one's a standard clause. And then right after that, I have this offer is conditional upon the following: the buyer arranging at the buyer's own expense, right? A new first charge mortgage satisfactory to the buyer and the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. Then we have the inspection clause. So same thing, very similar verbiage. So the inspection of the subject property by a home inspector at the buyer's own expense, and the obtaining of a report satisfactory to the buyer, and then the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. The seller agrees to cooperate in providing access to the property for the purpose of this inspection, right? So two things there. The part that puts the buyers and the buyer's sole and absolute discretion. So that, what does sole and absolute discretion mean? That means I can say, I don't want the house because of financing. I don't want the house because of inspection. And that's the only reason I need to give. I don't need to give any sort of reason. I don't need to provide you the inspection report. I don't need to do anything because it's in my sole and absolute discretion. So if my financing isn't working out, you can't ask me to prove it. If the inspection didn't go well, you can't ask me to provide your report because I'm not obligated to. As a seller, if you're not comfortable with this, talk about it, right? Ask the questions. Why are they putting in this? This is a typical one because it's really a purpose for the buyer to be able to walk away. If you're confident in your property, you'll have no issue signing this because, either A, it's going to be they can't get their own financing, or B, the inspection is really bad, and any normal, reasonable person will say, hey, we loved the house originally, but went through the inspection, we found this, this, and this wrong. I'm not sure if we're willing to negotiate further to remediate it. Let us think about it, whatever the case is, right? Some people will say, okay, take off an extra, the furnace is done, the air conditioning is done, take off $10,000 and we'll have a deal, and yada, 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 right? Or sometimes there'll be a surprise thing like, hey, we found a super massive crack in the foundation. We need more inspections to see how much it's going to cost. Let's extend the conditions for an extra 3-4 days so we can get somebody in there to quote it or whatever, right? And then you go from there. And then you say, okay, well, it's going to cost about another 15,000. Are you comfortable, moving forward if we reduce the amount by 15,000 to cover that expense? Yada, 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 right? All these things can be yes, no, maybe, negotiate, whatever, right? So that's what the clause, the conditions are there for. They are there to protect the buyer. There are conditions to protect the seller, right? The number one condition for a seller, if you ever want to have a walkaway clause as a seller, is to put in a lawyer review, right? Satisfactory to my lawyer reviewing this agreement of purchase and sale. And that can be for people that are inheriting properties, people that are, whatever the case is, any sort of situation where you need lawyer's advice, that can be pretty much considered a walkaway clause, just to cover your behind, right? And then it goes basically, so the A and B are the conditions themselves, and then the finalizing of the condition is the date, right? So unless the buyer gives notice in writing delivered to the seller not later than 9 p.m. on the 25th day of November 2025, that these conditions have been fulfilled, this offer shall become null and void, and deposits shall be returned to the buyer in full without deduction. And these conditions are included for the benefit of the buyer and may be waived at the buyer's sole option by notice in writing to the seller within the time period stated herein. So pretty standard, right? So just keep that in mind when talking about conditions. In addition to any other provision in this agreement, the seller will allow access to the property to the buyer's lender or appraiser in the event of an appraisal is required at any time prior to the completion date. This is separate from it's separate from the financing itself. So it can be, maybe you have 2 weeks of conditions and the financing goes through, but a week before closing, they say, hey, we need to have an appraiser walk through. It's happened tons of times. They've come in 3-4 days before closing. It's pretty standard. That clauses there is just so you can allow them access to it. So you are allowing access. If you don't allow access for an appraiser, you are in breach of contract. The seller represents and warrants the chattels and fixtures are as included in this agreement of the purchase and sale will be in good working order and free from all liens and encumbrances on completion. The agreement of the parties agree that this representation and warranty shall survive and not merge on completion of this transaction, but apply only to the state of the property at completion of this transaction. So this one is huge. This has saved a lot of my buyers tons of money. Anything that happens within the property, so if furnace goes wrong, windows break, doesn't matter. The seller needs to maintain it up until the closing date. After the closing date, it's in the buyer's hands. Notwithstanding the chattels excluded and included previously in this agreement shall include the appropriate. So basically, I'm just clarifying what's included. I put this as a standard clause, and it's on the seller to make sure that the things that they don't have here are crossed out. So if you're a seller and you see this clause come across, cross out the things you don't have. Because if you don't have a central air conditioning and you have one of these, and somebody takes you up on the contract, right? Like if you don't have a central vacuum and you're saying that it does, then why are you saying that, right? Seller represents and warrants that the property is not and will not be subject to the city's vacant unit tax, so that's standard. The seller and buyer agree the vacant units. Okay, so just vacant unit tax talk. Which one's this? This is the Property by Non-Canadians Act. So basically, not owned by a non-Canadian. The buyer shall have the right to view the property 2 more times. This is your walkthroughs. This is not another inspection, but this is a time where you check your property, right? So typically, I always say you have 2 walkthroughs. If you want more, say them ahead of time, because adding more walkthroughs is going to be next to impossible, because any seller does not want more walkthroughs. They actually want less. They want less people going through the house. They just don't want walkthroughs, right? So because they're prepping for the move, right? So basically, what you want to be doing is scheduling your first walkthrough. Typically after you've firmed up, like within a couple of weeks, you go take your measurements, you go take pictures of what you need to do. If you're doing renos, all these things, get your quotes done. Always save one walkthrough for a couple of days before closing. You want to check all the appliances, you want to check all the stuff that you're getting with the property, so that you make sure that it works, obviously. And if it doesn't work, you let your lawyer know right away, and then they can take care of it prior to closing, right? So what they'll do is they'll typically do a holdback on the amount of money that they're giving. They'll say, hey, let us know when you're going to be fixing this, or let us know when you're going to be sending us a check for the cost difference to fix it or replace it, right? So that's typically what's that done, and always keep it for a day, 2, 3 days max prior to closing. Seller agrees to deliver the real property to the buyer on closing in the same condition with no alterations as at the same time of the agreement on purchase and sale. The property will be left empty unless otherwise agreed upon, and broom clean, right? So clean property, standard, and then the electronic signatures, right? That's the last one. So we've done that. We've reviewed it. One last thing you're going to need. So let's open up a new one. Confirmation of cooperation. So we're going to go here to the Ontario one. This one is how the agents gets paid. It's super easy. There's not much you need to do here. It's going to populate the buyer name, seller name, the transaction property. If it's single representation, they're just going to click off 1A and then 1, and then they're going to click off 4A, 4A1, and then you're going to click off this, and it's going to be, call it 2% plus HST. Name of cooperating brokers. So in this agreement, it's us. So, and then I would put my name here, whatever. And then this would be the selling brokerage, and then the buyer initials or buyer signatures, seller signatures. And then there is consent for multiple representation. In this agreement, we don't have multiple representation because these items would also change too, right? So that would actually stay. So the cooperating commission would stay. This would change depending on what kind of agreement is in there. So if it's multiple representation, the seller brokerage has entered into representation agreement with the buyer, and there is multiple representations. That's one option. There's also a few options here. So the seller brokerage or a designated representative of the seller brokerage is providing assistance to the buyer, and the buyer is a self-represented party. I never recommend this one, just so you know. I always say either get yourself an agent because it's not going to cost you a penny. Do not self-represent yourself. The seller client and the buyer client are each separately represented by different designated representatives of the same brokerage, and there's no multiple representation. This will actually quite often happen with my brokerage. So our brokerage is pretty big. EXP is pretty big worldwide and Canada wide, but it does happen pretty often. So typically I'll have somebody Like, let's say they're another agent from our brokerage, but they're a complete different team. I've never met them. I don't know anything about them, but we're signed on designated representation agreements. So what that'll be is basically they're signed to John Frank, and my client is signed to me. So what we do is we click on this option here, click on 1A, and this is technically still considered single representation. There is no multiple representation because the designated representatives are each separate from each party. So they have theirs, you have yours, and off we go. So that pretty much explains that. What I'll do is I'll do an addition for the RECO information guide and the buyer designated agreement. All right.